Hello, greeting from New York. My name is Vangeline. I am the director of the Vangeline Theatre and the director of the New York Butoh Institute. It is my great pleasure to respond to Brenda's invitation to take part in Dancing with the Universe, the festival that is taking place in Colombia in October 2020. I am also the author of the book Butoh Cradling Empty Space that is coming out in October. And it is my great pleasure, I want to show you, my great pleasure to introduce this book to you and to take part in this discussion about Butoh and neuroscience. Why is it important or even interesting to talk or study Butoh from a scientific perspective? I have felt for a long time, for my 20 years as a dancer, teacher, curator, choreographer, also student of Butoh, that there was not enough data and scientific data or studies made about the art form, and as a result there is not a lot of consensus about Butoh. I think Butoh is an art form that is very misunderstood, and whenever we want to transmit an art form, we have to be able to talk about techniques, and that means that an art form, if it remains only in an oral tradition passed verbally without any writings from dancers, practitioners, there's a danger of not only the art form getting lost over time and techniques being lost over time, but also it's very difficult to reach consensus or an agreement about what the art form consists of and what are the different techniques and what are exactly Butoh dancers doing. So I think there's a lot of confusion and questions in a lot of people's minds all around the world, as Butoh has become an art form that is now practiced really globally, not only in Japan. Actually, starting in the late 70s, Butoh moved to Europe and then the rest of the world. And now, as we are moving into an era where there are more practitioners that are not Japanese and non-Japanese, maybe I think there is a greater need to understand what Butoh dancers are doing. But for me, the interest in studying Butoh scientifically really came from my own interest in studying dance and understanding dance from a scientific perspective, especially as we live now in an era where we have access to technology that we did not have access to necessarily in the 20th century. Although due to imaging technologies, we have been for a long time been able to study the brain of people. Usually it would be done in an MRI and people would have to lie down and not be able to move. So studying the brain activity of people in motion has been a challenge for quite some time. And now we have portable devices that are actually have added a gyroscope, that accelerometer, that are able to sort of decipher the brain activity, placing sensors on the head of people in motion. And so there are very interesting studies that have been done that I know of in the US with Susan Dicker, a neuroscientist from NYU who studied the brain activity of tango dancers. And so I had been studying and sort of researching what technology is available and how could we ourselves in the Butoh field study the brain activity of Butoh dancers. And to me that is very interesting because I think that the way Butoh has been presented to us and taught to us is that it is a departure from the thinking brain, that we have to be able to go access all the parts of the brain when we dance Butoh, that we cannot be analyzing and be simply logical when we dance Butoh. And maybe when we dance period, we have so much to discover, and perhaps the studies that we will conduct in years to come will give us a lot of insight on comparing, for example, Butoh from ballet or Butoh from modern dance, and maybe we will find out that there's not a lot of difference. It's really difficult to know at this time, and that is why it's interesting to gather more scientific data and to engage with this art form in a way that is a little bit more scientific. And so in 2019, our company, the New York Butoh Institute, launched a project with the help of a portable device called Muse 2 that has been used in numerous universities and that has been used also to study the activities of monks in Nepal. We recorded the brain activity of 3 Butoh dancers, one from Japan, Dai Matsuoka, who was one of the dancers of Sankaijuku. Another dancer was Brenda from Colombia. Very briefly in October 2019 when she came to New York to take part into our Butoh festival. And I also recorded my own brain activity in April 2019 during a project called Erasure, a solo project. And so the data that we have remains anecdotal, meaning that the sample size is quite small. It's 3 people, is not enough to really come to conclusion, but it was a preliminary or first step into the direction of gathering more data. And the next step is to work with a control study and to work with a larger sample group, repeat times in New York in 2021, 2022. In 2020, unfortunately, the pandemic stopped us a little bit from being able to conduct this research. And what we're hoping to find out is whether there is a predominant brain activity during Butoh improvisation, which our initial small sample data would seem to suggest, but it's our working hypothesis is that Butoh dancers perhaps operate predominantly in delta brainwave. But of course, we don't know until we conduct a large-scale study, and also the interesting part is to conduct a control study where we're actually comparing the results from Butoh dancers to another type of dance, such as ballet or contemporary dance or modern, and are there differences and are there significant differences that we can see. And so we hope to contribute to the field by conducting this research, and we're hoping that by conducting scientific studies we will get better insight into this art form called Butoh. And another part of the study that we will be conducting is also to conduct data and from the dancers themselves, meaning that we can compare the subjective experience of the dancer with the data that we receive, which is quite objective and scientific. So this is in a nutshell the plan that we have, and I also wanted to talk a little bit about my book and also about my work in correctional facilities. And so the reason why I wrote this book is, on the one hand, because I felt that there was not enough practical information or information about the body and what happens to practitioners and to dancers and students in the literature about Butoh, at least in the United States and in Europe. A lot of the literature is historical and also theoretical. So while it's invaluable and interesting, I felt that there was a great need for someone who's a practitioner, who's actually teaching, dancing, performing, curating, to write about Butoh. And I wanted to share my perspective as well as a woman, given the fact that Butoh has been a very patriarchal, male-dominated art form that has been predominantly described and viewed and advertised and promoted from a male perspective, with a very high emphasis on the work of men and less interest has been taken in women dancers and women practitioners, and that is something that I think almost every art form is facing in the 21st century, and we are starting to look at issues of gender and diversity and writing from a little bit of a more expansive point of view. of course, my work as a teacher with very different populations for the past 20 years has really informed my perspective. I have worked with elderly people, high school students, university students, the general population, people with mental difficulties, people with mental illness, people with disabilities, muscular dystrophy, people who are not able-bodied, who are in wheelchairs, people who are visually impaired, people who are hearing impaired. And also a big focus of my work as a teacher has been working with the incarcerated population in New York State. And so I started this work in 2006 and worked weekly, sometimes bi-weekly, first with women who are incarcerated and then with men and women who are incarcerated in minimum, medium and maximum security facilities. And this work has been very instrumental for me as a teacher, and also has informed my desire to conduct research. It's evident to me that Butoh can be very beneficial to a lot of different populations across the board. And it's also evident to me that we can use specific exercises in Butoh and that they can be therapeutic, they can be rehabilitative, they can help people from different populations, including people from the incarcerated population, who face a great number of difficulties during their incarceration. However, again, we lack data, and I think data and having a scientifically minded approach would be really important. So at this point in this discussion, I'm sharing my impressions and my experience with the understanding that there is no data available. It's only my experience as a teacher and as an educator. But one of the questions that kept coming back for me is when I started working with people with psychiatric disorders or PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome, or people in incarcerated environments, is the role of stress in learning and the role and the impact of stress on learners. And that is very interesting because there's actually a lot of scientific data and literature on stress and PTSD and the impact on stress on people who learn, and the impact that is also physiological on the body, on the central nervous system. And also there are short-term and long-term impact on the learner. And for example, to give a specific example to the viewer, if people who are incarcerated live in a very high stress environment, so we have to take into account when we are teaching into the environment in which the student is receiving the information. If a student is living day in, day out in a high stress environment, what kind of strategy is useful and what can we learn from this experience, and what kind of impact can we hope to have on that population? Can we go into that situation hoping to counteract the effect of the high stress that they are experiencing? Are we going into that situation hoping to lessen the stress? Is the lessening of the stress temporary? Can it have a larger impact on that population? These are questions that are important when we are considering the populations that we are teaching. And to that extent, I can say with some degree of confidence that people with PTSD also can experience a Butoh class, or any class for that matter, in a very different way than the regular population. They can be triggered very unexpectedly in a Butoh class. And how is a teacher going to deal with this situation? What kind of strategy needs to be in place? What kind of training do teachers need to have, knowing that a dance student that is going into the unconsciousness of the body runs the risk of being triggered. And we need strategies to deal with stress and PTSD. As teachers of Butoh is my feeling and my impression at this time. And perhaps I'm asking questions in my book on these kinds of issues. Another issue that I'm dealing with and talking about in my book is the cross-cultural aspect of Butoh. Butoh is an art form that, although influenced by European techniques, was developed in Japan in the 1950s, 60s and up to the 80s until it again returned to Europe, North and South America and the rest of the world. And so now we can say confidently that most of the educational settings happen in cross-cultural context, meaning that maybe the teacher is Japanese, but the learning is taking place in another country. And so this is considered cross-cultural, meaning there's an encounter of cultures, and we need to look at that very carefully, because also the cross-cultural aspect has an impact on learning, has an impact on how the learner that may be from a different culture, who is receiving this knowledge through the filter of their own cultural education and conditioning, how this affects them, maybe differently than a Japanese person. And so these are important considerations that cannot be ignored anymore as Butoh has evolved and moved in the 21st century into an art form that is mostly cross-cultural. And then last is also the issue of gender. The fact that Butoh is a male-dominated art form where the power is held mostly by men, and it's an art form that is predominantly learned by women. And at least in America, North America and Europe, my conclusion has been that usually it's around 70% women in the classroom. And so you have an art form that's male-dominated and learned mostly by women. And again, we need to look at that situation very carefully and take this data into careful consideration. What kind of impact does it have on a woman to mostly receive training from a man? And can men understand the specific gender challenges that women or those that identify as women are facing when they undergo Butoh training? So these are perhaps the main three issues that I deal with or approach in my book. Again, a lot of these are theories. It's not yet based on actual data. We are hoping that data will be conducted in the next 10, 20, 30 years, and that 30 years from now we will have a lot more information to approach this art form called Butoh from. And I think that's a very important effort, because Butoh is an art form that deserves this degree of scrutiny, this degree of research. It's an art form that I think can say for the past 20 years it's helped a lot of people. But there's so much that we don't know, and we need to proceed, I think, in an ethical manner. And to me, an ethical manner is gathering as much information as possible and not passing information that we don't understand necessarily. It's important on some level when it comes to dance to train people implicitly, meaning we learn dance implicitly for the most part, from body to body, but there's also has to be an effort to understand what we are doing. That is a responsible way to engage with the art form in the 20th century, and I'm really glad that in Colombia and in other parts of the world this effort is being underway. I want to thank you for listening. I also want to tell you that the book is available on Amazon. So I think it's available in Colombia through Amazon.com as a print book that you can order or as an ebook. And I hope that you will enjoy it, and I hope that we can continue to have this kind of dialogue and endeavors that help move the art form forward. Thank you so much, Brenda. Thank you so much, everyone. I hope you have a great festival, and thank you.